Okay, our special guest today is George Weigel, Distinguished Senior Fellow at the Ethics and Public Policy Center. He's also the author of many books, including his latest, The Next Pope, The Office of Peter, and A Church in Mission. George, thanks so much for being on the show today.
Great to be with you, Mike, and nice to see you again.
So I've been somebody who's read your articles for many years, and you wrote one recently that really caught my eye. It was a few months ago, and you talked about Catholic campus ministry as being in sort of a golden age, and that line just jumped out of that article. And I thought we could start with that by why would you write that, and how do you consider Catholic campus ministry today?
That was in my weekly Catholic Press column, and I think it was the column in which I was trying to point out any number of good things that are going on in the church today. There's so much of the media focus is on trouble and scandal and shutdown and all the rest of it that I thought it was important to lift up some good things. When I say that Catholic campus ministry is in something of a golden age today, I don't mean to suggest that we don't have a lot of work to do. The association with which you lead is meant to improve the quality of Catholic campus ministry. So there's a lot of work to be done. What I do mean is that we now have models of really dynamic and powerful Catholic campus ministries that in a very challenging cultural situation and often in unexpected places, unexpected institutions of higher learning, are producing missionary disciples for the Church of the New Evangelization. I think the obvious first example of this is the Catholic campus ministry at Texas A&M University in College Station, Texas. In my view, that's the gold standard for doing this. It's an astonishing accomplishment led by remarkable series of campus ministers, two of whom are now bishops, over the past 25 years. But really in the heart of the Bible Belt, in a big state university with not a predominantly Catholic population, you have this dynamic, evangelically vibrant Catholic campus ministry that, to take one measure, has produced more religious vocations in the last 2 decades than that little school in northwestern Indiana with the Golden Dome in the middle of the campus. So that's one thing. What's going on in Omaha? What's going on in Lincoln? What's Nebraska? What's going on through the remarkable growth of Focus, the Fellowship of Catholic University Students, bringing the gospel to over 125 campuses right now being imitated or imitated in or exported to Europe, where the church is desperate for models of new evangelization ministries and initiatives. All of this suggests to me that there's a vitality in Catholic campus ministry that was not present 10, 15 years ago. One other example, I'll mention it because it's based here in Washington. My friends at the Dominican House of Studies here, several years ago, created what they called the Thomistic Institute to bring really high-end Catholic intellectual life into prestigious campuses. This has been a remarkable success around the country and is now being duplicated in Europe as well. So why is this happening? Part of it is because there is a generation of priest and lay campus ministry leaders who understand how urgent this ministry is in the church today. I think a lot of it may have to do with the ongoing influence of Pope St. John Paul II, who was, after all, a campus minister. And as I think I showed in both volumes of my biography of John Paul, was profoundly influenced throughout his entire life by his experience of campus ministry, which has now reverberated around the whole church. So those are some things that come to mind right off the top of my head.
And it's certainly true when programs, as you said, we have models now, but when programs have a focus on Christ and a passionate clarity of mission, usually good things follow. And it is a very exciting time in Catholic campus ministry. Although, as you say, we're still only on 25% of the nation's four-year campuses. So there's a lot of work to be done. Let's pivot to talking about your new book. And one of the things that you talk about a lot is the contrast between profoundly focused on Christ and animated by that and Catholic light. And that's certainly something that we see on the college level, that when a campus, Catholic or otherwise, attempts to do Catholic light, it doesn't usually work well. So maybe unpack that idea for us a little bit more of what you've seen in terms of this idea of Catholic light.
Well, this is a term I've been using really since the abuse crisis of 2002, which I think was all that led up to that was profoundly affected by a dumbing down of doctrine, of moral expectation, a dumbing down of formation in seminaries, all of which I lumped under the rubric of Catholic light. In the new book, The Next Pope, I'm getting worse as I get older here, Mike. I have now extended the Coca-Cola analogy to say that Catholic light inevitably leads to Catholic zero. And I think we see that in Europe, where I used to think that what was going on in something like the Catholic situation in Germany, 2% mass attendance in major cities, was a question of a kind of psychological schism. People had checked out of relationship to the universal church. I don't think that anymore. I think it's apostasy. People have simply ceased to believe in the truth of the gospel and in Jesus Christ as the unique Savior of the world, who reveals both the truth about God and, as the Second Vatican Council insisted, the truth about us. In the face of Christ, we meet the merciful Father, and we meet the truth about our humanity. Where the church puts Christ at the center and invites men and women into friendship with him, the church is vibrant and vital. When the church is simply another non-governmental organization doing good works, however good they are, it's going to wither and die. But if I could come back for just 1 second to where we began, there was one other point that I wanted to make there. For over a quarter of a century now, I have been involved in an international Catholic leadership training program working with graduate students called the Tertio Millennio Seminar. We meet in Krakow every summer, had done for 29 years until this ghastly year of 2020 made us have to suspend the program. What we've discovered in that, this is a 3-week kind of crash course in Catholic social doctrine. But it works because it's a full immersion Catholic experience. It's a liturgical experience. We have daily Mass every day. It's a cultural experience. People experience Catholic culture in Krakow. It's a community experience. People eat together, live together, recreate together, and it's an intellectual experience. And I think the campus ministries that have really taken off these days are those that are what I would call full package campus ministries that offer young people this full immersion experience including, as I know, some are now moving to a residential experience. This is not without some significance, but it's always Christocentric, but it's got to have all these component parts. It's got to have an intellectual piece, a liturgical piece, a cultural piece, and a communal piece. And that communal piece often has to, really often, it has to include a service piece, because we've got to, give these young people, offer them an opportunity to live the gospel of service, as well as meet the Lord sacramentally and meet the truths of Catholic faith intellectually. So, sorry to come back to that, but I think that's an important point to make.
No, it is important. And I think to your point, it's not just a matter of checking off boxes, but there's real substance. It's not just that they have Mass, but they're trying to celebrate Mass well. It's not just that they have an occasional lecturer, but they have a lecture series, or like you said, an institute. So there's real depth. And I think you're right. Those are the programs that really are flourishing. I want to pivot to your new book, The Next Pope, The Office of Peter in a Church in Mission. And I did a little bit of homework and found that this is not your first book on a pope, or even a pope in transition. I was curious, George, as to how the reaction has been to this book compared to your 2005 book on Pope Benedict.
Well, it's kind of early days yet on the next Pope. The book of that title was only published in July. We're talking in the middle of September. There have been some very fine reviews, for which I'm grateful. The review in First Thing said that this was the instrumentum laboris, the agenda for the next conclave. I would not be displeased if that were the case. Because this really isn't a book about church politics. It's an agenda for an evangelically vibrant church in the 21st century, viewed through the prism of this unique institution of the papacy and how it can energize that. I wrote it earlier this year because I was getting quite frustrated with, frankly, the vulgarity and silliness of a lot of the Twitter and Facebook and other forms of social media arguing about the future of the church. This is not helpful. And I thought I had a responsibility as someone who has had the privilege of knowing and working with both Pope Francis and his two predecessors, in different degrees with each one, of course. I had a responsibility to think through that experience and suggest what it might suggest, what my experience of those three men might suggest about the papacy of the future. So that's what this is about. This is an agenda book for the whole church, but viewed through the prism of the papacy. So I hope it's of interest to everybody, and not just people who might think for some really strange reason that they would want to be Pope.
Well,
no one should want to be the Pope. If you want to be the Pope, that's a good sign that you probably ought not to be.
Well, and I've heard you talk about the low information Catholic news diet, which is probably a good thing these days, just to limit what we're reading, because it can get to you after a while, and the rancor is not helpful to unity. You've talked about the next pope as being a transitional pope, or a transitional papacy. Explain a little bit more what you mean by that.
Well, it's a transition within a transition. I mean, as you know from my previous book, The Irony of Modern Catholic History, and from my book, Evangelical Catholicism, I think we are in the fifth great transitional epoch in 2,000 years of Catholic history. And it's the transition from the Church of the Counter-Reformation, formed in the wake of the Council of Trent, to the Church of the New Evangelization, the first seeds of which are planted by Leo XIII in the late 19th century, the transition being accelerated by the Second Vatican Council, and the New Evangelization being proposed as the grand strategy of the Church's 21st century and third millennium by John Paul II. Within that transition, there's another transition that will take place in the next pontificate. Whoever the next pope is, he will not have had the experience of the Second Vatican Council that his three predecessors had. John Paul II and Benedict XVI were both significant figures at Vatican II. Pope Francis was not at the council, but he was a young Jesuit at the time of the council. He was a Jesuit superior in the turbulent years immediately after the council. So these are conciliar popes in a very specific sense. The next pope might have been a teenager at the time of the Second Vatican Council. He might even, if the cardinals should choose an exceptional young man, he might even have been a child at the time of the Second Vatican Council. But let's stipulate that the next pope is going to, would have been a teenager or a young man. That means that he will have lived his entire mature Catholic experience in the turbulence of the post-conciliar church, without an existential experience of the pre-conciliar church, or an immediate experience of the council itself. So this is going to be different. I mean, it's obvious that this is going to happen at some point. This is the point at which it's going to happen, and it's not a point I stress in the book. I think the critical point, not only for the next pope but for all the rest of us to understand, is this transition from the Counter-Reformation Church, often in its last century, focused on institutional maintenance and the defense of the institutions of the church, into the Church of the New Evangelization, in which those institutions become launch platforms for mission. Whether those are parishes, schools, campus ministries, religious communities, families, seminaries, convents, whatever. They all ought to be launch platforms for mission. Why? Because the transmission of the faith by ethnic or cultural inheritance is over in the Western world. It's just not going to happen anymore. So we have to all own the Great Commission of Matthew 28, go and make disciples of all nations, and live that in our unique states of life and apostolates in the church.
I've contended that a lot of dioceses, parishes, they're trying to do too much. They're spinning a dozen plates, 24 plates. And I know you've talked a lot in the new book about missionary discipleship, and not that it's your term, but you talk about the next pope, the next papacy really needs to double down on this, that this is a continuation of John Paul and then Benedict and Francis. Here's a tricky question for you. So let's say a diocese really makes missionary discipleship the central component of their parish life, their campus ministry life, their diocesan life. What might that imply in terms of maybe the church should emphasize less? In other words, we can't do everything. We can't keep spinning 25, 35, 45 plates. We all know that we want to focus on the basics of Catholicism, but no one wants to say we're going to do less of X, Y, or Z.
Well, I'd have two answers to that, Mike. Anybody who's interested in pursuing that might get in touch with Archbishop Alan Vigneron in Detroit, who led a multi-year synodal process of discussion with the people and priests of the archdiocese that led to a formal archdiocesan synod a couple of years ago, which led to a pastoral plan for the archdiocese that is entirely focused on missionary discipleship and that orients everything within the diocese to that. So, that's underway. I mean, and I think people can get in touch with Archbishop Vigneron and his staff in Detroit, and see how they really put themselves through a multi-year examination of conscience. How are we failing to be and succeeding at being the Church of the New Evangelization, and what need we to do to talk about that, to make that happen more effectively. The more chippy answer would be we're way overstructured in the Catholic Church. I will not name the diocese or the bishop, but a friend of mine became the ordinary of a diocese 5 or 6 years ago. A few weeks after his installation, we were talking, and I said, "So, what have you found out?" And he said, "Well, I've found out I got a lot more financial problems than I thought I would have." And I said to him, "Send me the organization chart. In 3 days, I will cut 60% of it out of it. And believe me, no one will know or notice except the people you're going to have to let go." I mean, we are way, way overstaffed at the diocesan level. And nonetheless, if a diocese commits itself to this vision of everyone is a missionary disciple, then you at least have the option of trying to turn all of these offices and committees and commissions and whatever into engines of evangelization. But I guess the the change of mentality that is required here is one that measures vitality by evangelical effectiveness. When I'm describing this in parishes, I often say we've got to change the paradigm for how we measure parish vitality. I think in virtually every diocese in the country, a snapshot is taken of church attendance on a particular Sunday. It's usually in October. This is not going to be a good year to do that. But in previous years, in normal years, you'd count up who's in church on a particular Sunday in October. It would give you a kind of snapshot of where you are compared to a year ago or 5 years ago or 10 years ago. I suggest to parishes that's the wrong snapshot. The real measure is how many people are baptized, how many adults are baptized, and how many adults are received into full communion with the church at the Easter Vigil. That's the measuring rod. Are we, if you will, growing this by bringing new friends of the Lord into the community of disciples? That's the measure. And I think parishes that understand that that's the measure have a real vitality to them. But, this is going to take a while, I think, for people to get their heads wrapped around. Even if you're 40 years old today, you're thinking of the Catholic Church, despite the last 15 or 20 years, as a reasonably stable institution with a future. We can't think of the church that way anymore. We have to think of the church in terms of the gospel to be proposed and the Lord to be met, because that's the only way there's going to be a future. The only way there's going to be a future is through the deeper conversion of those who are already part of the church, and the conversion of this increasing number of lapsed or utterly unevangelized people who are all around us in whatever environment we find ourselves in.
You've talked about, this difference between an apostolic time, which we're in now, versus a Christendom time.
Yeah.
And certainly on the college campus, that's very true. What does that mean for Catholics to see themselves as apostles in 2020?
Well, Christendom times are times in which the public culture, the ambient public culture, the air we breathe, either helps transmit the faith or is not an obstacle to the transmission of In my book, Letters to a Young Catholic, which I think a lot of campus ministries use as a kind of adult catechetical text, I described growing up in Baltimore in the late 50s and early 1960s, where the cultural air helped our parents, grandparents, priests, sisters, transmit the faith to us. Now, we all know that that's simply not the case anymore. The cultural air is not neutral, it's hostile to the, especially to the truths that biblical religion and Catholic faith teach us about the human person. So we have to recognize that we're not in that Christendom time. We're in a situation not dissimilar to that first apostolic band, which set out from Judea in the first century, and over the next 250 years, that Christian movement converted somewhere between a third and a half of the Mediterranean world. That's an apostolic church, a church that has institutions, but all of those institutions are mission-focused, mission-oriented, and measure themselves by mission effectiveness. I think at the individual or personal level, this means understanding that on the day of our baptism, we are given the Great Commission. Go and make disciples of all nations. That's not just a task for a certain subset of people called missionaries. That's a task for all of us. And we'll do it in different ways. Some of us will do it by example. Some of us will do it by outright proclamation of the gospel. Others will do it by argument and proposal and debate. But we all have to think about ourselves in those terms.
George, one last question. I wonder if you could speak to the campus minister, the chaplain, the lay person, the priest, the religious who's working on a college campus, and what's a word of encouragement that you would share with them? You know, many times they're grossly outnumbered. It's one campus minister to 1,000 students, or even it's 20 campus ministers to 40,000 students. We're always outnumbered, but I wonder what's a word of encouragement that you could leave with them today?
Well, I guess my word of encouragement would be, we've got the most exciting, compelling proposal in the world. There is nothing that the culture is proposing that has a grander vision of human possibility than the gospel of Jesus Christ, which tells us that we are made by God and for God and to be with God. That's a lot better offer than what's being marketed elsewhere. In a very practical way, I would suggest that campus ministers have a look at the third chapter of the first volume of my John Paul II biography, Witness to Hope, which is about Karol Wojtyła as campus minister. He was doing this in a lot harder circumstances than we had. Stalinist era, communist Poland. And you see how he did it, retail, and built out from this retail ministry to a vision of ecclesial possibility that has affected the church all over the world. Some years ago, 2014 to be exact, I was in Krakow for my summer seminar. My son was with me to take the photographs for a guidebook to Krakow we were doing for World Youth Day in 2016. And some friends of mine who were some of Wojtyła's old kids from this campus ministry were celebrating their 50th wedding anniversary. And so I was invited and with my son to this event, which was lovely. And we're standing outside Wawel Cathedral in Krakow on this July evening. And there were a lot of these other Wojtyła kids who are now 70 or 80 years old, gathered around the anniversary couple. And I said to my son, you are looking at the beginning of World Youth Day. You know, World Youth Day did not begin in 1984. World Youth Day began with these people here in very, very challenging circumstances. And, that should be some encouragement to us, I think.
Our special guest today has been George Weigel, Distinguished Senior Fellow of the Ethics and Public Policy Center and author of the brand new book, The Next Pope, The Office of Peter and a Mission and a Church in Mission. George, thank you very much for being our guest today.
My pleasure, Mike. Thanks for having me.